Good afternoon, Senator. Stephen Moore, First Assistant Secretary, Defence Industry Policy.
Mr Moore, welcome. My understanding is Minister Conroy announced earlier this year a review of defence industry policy. Could you briefly give us an overview of what the scope is, what the time frame is, and who you are consulting as part of that?
Certainly, Senator. Minister announced that we would review the defence industry policy as part of a defence industry development strategy. That commenced last year. At the start of that process, we consulted with around 120 different organisations and individuals, so a fairly extensive public consultation at the start of that. We are now working up that policy and continue to consult within defence and across government, and also continuing to consult with industry as we look at parts of that policy, testing some of those ideas with industry. And in fact, that consultation continues.
Do you take on notice of that group, 120 was it?
It's a little over 120.
Yeah, can you take on notice, give us a list of who you consulted there, particularly just so we get an idea of the spread of representative bodies versus SMEs versus startups versus primes, etc.?
We can get that for you, Senator. It was a mix. We had a mix of small to micro businesses, industry associations. We spoke with state governments in that process and primes as well. So it was quite a large spread of people, but we can get that for you.
And was that by invitation to them, or did you make an open call that companies could respond and have consultation with you?
It was by invitation, Senator, of people that we do regularly engage with. We know that have an interest in these policies, but we have not been selective or we have not turned away people that have wanted to contribute. In fact, I've met with a number of CEOs over the last few months that have said that they wanted to contribute to that development of that policy, and that continues. I think we're meeting with people later this week that have indicated that they'd like to input as well.
Sure. So Mr Conroy is quoted as saying, and I quote, "We recognise speed is of the essence. I've been really clear with defence and defence industry. I want a really hard-edged analysis of what are the key sovereign capabilities we need in this country and where defence needs to make investments to sustain those sovereign capabilities," end quote. Is that the key focus of this review?
It certainly is a focus, Senator, but we are considering a range of issues as part of that policy development. I know that the Minister has asked us to have a look at how we might be more targeted and detailed in our sovereign industry capabilities, but we'll also consider the sorts of things that you've heard evidence over the last couple of days around workforce and innovation and how we can speed up procurement. So we'll consider a range of issues to support industry.
Sure. Have you read the Defence Industry Policy Statement of 2016?
I certainly have, Senator.
Okay, so on page 23, where it talks about the change from the First Principles Review to recognising defence industry as a fundamental input, it goes, and I'm quoting here, "There are some capabilities that are so important to Australian defence missions they must be developed or supported by Australian industry because overseas sources do not provide the required security or assurances we need. As such, it's critical the industry base associated with these capabilities maintained and supported by defence as sovereign industry capabilities," end quote. And so the whole plan was designed to actually achieve the very same thing Mr Conroy is talking about, which is changing the focus of our industry policy from Australian industry content to what are Australian industry capabilities that we need them to have in order for us to achieve the following. And on page 24 it talks about the protection of intent, the independence of action, assurance of supply, essential skills retention, and leveraging competitive advantage. So those were the aims of DIPS 2016. What is different in terms of what you're seeking to achieve under this review with what was stated in DIPS 2016? Because that seems to be a very comparable and, I would say, admirable aim. What are you going to do differently? Because DIPS 2016 didn't work out as either those of us on this side of the lake or industry were expecting.
Senator, I don't think at this stage I will prejudge what the policy will say. We are still working through those issues. I think what you've said there is not inconsistent with what Minister Conroy has said. Certainly, though, as with the DSR, we are looking at what the right priorities are for sovereign industrial capabilities, and that we are working through that now. But there is still an intent and a need to grow Australian sovereign industry in the parts that the Australian Defence Force is going to need it the most.
So can I ask you how you're planning to go about that? Because the intent in DIPS, as then I think your equivalent Kate Lewis was pushing, was to try and have an evaluation of what does defence need industry to be able to do to meet all those sovereign action, independent action type requirements. What Defence ended up doing was essentially conducting a survey of saying what can industry currently do, and then trying to distill that down to what do we think is nice and what would we like to support. And so the priority was wrong. So I'm asking you now, how are you going to go about resolving what are these key priorities?
Senator, I understand that. What I think I'm saying is that we are still working through that, and we'll present that as part of the industry strategy. I don't want to prejudge or assume what government might want us to do in that regard. We will present options to them and then build that into the strategy.
So is this a whole of government review of defence industry policy, looking at what other departments think about it?
We are certainly consulting with other departments, Senator, and the intent is that it is not developed in isolation.
Sure. So is the Department of Finance one of your stakeholders you're engaging with?
I'm almost certain the Department of Finance has been consulted. I can check that with you, Senator, but we have consulted with a number of departments over the last few months. I would be confident in saying that if they haven't, they certainly are on our list.
Sure. So there have been numerous inquiries into the relationship between government writ large, defence and industry and procurement. And one of the recurring themes, which probably came through most succinctly in the 2015 report of the Joint Standing Committee Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade into defence procurement and exports particularly, and also the 2020 report into the lessons of COVID around procurement for critical capabilities, were that the procurement rules are the root cause of failure to identify and to sustain sovereign Australian capabilities, and specifically in section 4.4, encouraging competition and being non-discriminatory. And in fact, Defence walked back its industry policy from the 2016 policy in another 2 iterations and increasingly distanced itself from the concept of actually identifying and investing in particular capabilities, to the point where they were briefing Australian companies that we are not going to choose you, we're not going to preference, we're not going to, even if you represent a high priority, we're not going to preference you because of the procurement rules. And then particularly also in 4.5 subpara C, the potential supplier's relevant experience and performance history has been used by departments, not just Defence, but ONI and others, to justify sole source decisions they have taken, even where the Commonwealth has spent taxpayers' money helping a small company to innovate and generate a disruptive technology or capability in line with a government policy intent, but that part of the procurement rules has been used to disqualify them from being contracted by the Commonwealth. So what are you doing specifically to look at what I would call the failure modes in our industry policy if we are serious about having not just identified sovereign capabilities but then sustaining them with contracts as opposed to grants?
Thank you, Senator. And Certainly the government has been quite clear to me and to my colleagues that reform to procurement needs to be part of our consideration of this strategy, and we are working very closely with Mr Deeble and work that he is doing in that regard. I don't know whether you have anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, Chris Deeble, Deputy Secretary of CASG. As I noted earlier when we discussed ASCA, we're looking at the continuum of work and how we can pull capability from innovation, through into acquisition, sustainment, and ultimately to get export opportunity for those companies. So that full continuum is now part of our consideration. The intent is that we will be looking at procurement reform to dovetail with the DID's priorities that are stated, and that means we'll have a different consideration of things like the Australian Industry Capability Policy and procurement policy and how that gets enacted through our ASTEFCON suite, and we'll be looking at the global supply chain in that context so that we can create that continuum. So I think to Stephen's point, that what we're trying to do now is stitch that together, and where there is the strategy and the industry strategy coming through the DIDs, that we're going to align our procurement strategy to be able to enable that. And when it comes to things like ASCA, we'll play in that continuum, offering more timely, more flexible arrangements to be able to pull that capability through into capability, which I think will address some of the issues that you noted, Senator.
So, perhaps, if I may, Senator Fawcett, the advice from Mr Deeble emphasises the importance of the consultation work that they are doing. They're preparing advice to government, and I imagine these and many other matters will form part of that advice.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. You may or may not be aware this has been an issue in how the Commonwealth, under both sides of politics, has run defence procurement.
I can tell from the nature of your questioning, Senator Fawcett. Please continue.
For several decades.
Please continue.
A number of people today have talked about the ANAO report into the Hunter class, but paragraph 289, I think, actually brings all of this to a focus, because in that paragraph, and I quote, "In its responses, Defence has conflated an industry policy objective, i.e. establishing a continuous naval shipbuilding program in Australia, with the achievement of value for money in procurement as required by the Commonwealth procurement rules." Now, Defence had identified and government had approved shipbuilding as one of the priority sovereign industry capabilities that defence procurement was required to support. And yet, because the concept of capability is not reflected anywhere in the Commonwealth procurement rules, there was no ability to attribute the establishment of a capability, a sovereign capability, as being value for money as opposed to the individual project. And so ANAO, and there's a whole raft of areas in their report, but this particular paragraph highlights the disconnect between audit agencies like ANAO, the procurement rules which are run by the Department of Finance, the Department of Defence, and government of whichever persuasion, which outlines a strategic priority, but all the enabling regulations and rules have not been lined up to make those work, and so we have failure mode. So, Mr Moore, can you give the committee an assurance that this review will specifically be getting the secretaries from the relevant departments together as part of the advice to government, highlighting how reform can occur in this area? Because if not, then this review will be doomed to failure like all the other reviews that we've had in the past.
Senator, I can assure you that that certainly we are talking to our colleagues across government, and I'm sure Mr Deeble is as well, to get at the sorts of things you are talking about.
Yeah, Senator, the Minister Conroy and Minister Miles have also been very clear that they want us to look at this whole range of issues. So I think we're in the process of bringing, looking at ideas, some of the ideas you've talked about, others. So I'd like to, while we're in the process of developing advice and options for government, I just want to assure you that we are taking the work seriously, and we are doing a lot of industry outreach. We are engaging with the other relevant departments.
Well, I wish you luck, Mr Moriarty, because finance has been engaged under multiple ministers and secretaries over the years with very little change in the procurement rules. But given the strategic requirements that the DSU identify and the requirements to have elements of our industry that are fundamental inputs to our defence capability, this is something we need to get right, and to get right quickly. And Chair, I may be formally asking that we ask the Secretary, Mr Moriarty, and the Secretary for Finance to come and provide a briefing as to how they can resolve this impasse, which has been long-standing. Thanks, Chair.